Working title: The Shed War. Ethan Carter had lived in his suburban neighborhood for nearly a decade. He had always played by the rules, or at least the ones that made sense. He kept his lawn trimmed, his trash bins properly stored, and his property well maintained. Unlike some of his neighbors, he had no intention of making waves in the Homeowners Association, HOA. But that was before she crossed the line. It all started on a regular Saturday morning. Ethan had just finished his coffee when he went outside to take out the trash. As he walked toward the side of his house, he caught a glimpse of something strange: his backyard shed. Something was off. The heavy-duty padlock that always secured the doors was missing. Frowning, he quickened his pace. As he pulled open the doors, his stomach dropped. The inside of his shed, his private storage space, was unrecognizable. Instead of his neatly arranged tools, garden supplies, and camping gear, the space was cluttered with someone else's junk. Stacks of plastic bins labeled with handwriting he didn't recognize were crammed against the walls. A folding table leaned against the shelves. An old baby crib and piles of dusty holiday decorations cluttered the floor. Confused, Ethan reached for the nearest bin and peeled off the lid. Inside, he found a collection of Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper. His gaze fell on a yellow sticky note attached to the lid. The words, written in a familiar scrawl, made his blood boil. Property of Karen. Karen Pearson. Of course, it was her. Anyone who had ever lived under the rule of an HOA knew a Karen like this. The self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. The woman who made it her life's mission to enforce rules selectively. Not only was she a board member, she practically was the HOA. And now, she had broken into his property and turned it into her personal storage unit. Ethan slammed the bin shut and marched straight down the street. Karen lived 4 houses down, in a pristine 2-story home with an obnoxiously perfect lawn. The moment she opened the door, she gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, Ethan. What a lovely surprise. What can I do for you?" Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Karen, why is your stuff in my shed?" Her expression didn't change, but he caught a flicker of guilt in her eyes before she waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that. Well, I noticed your shed was just sitting there, not being used to its full potential, and you know, the HOA has the right to repurpose underutilized spaces for the good of the community." Ethan stared at her, dumbfounded. "Excuse me? That shed is on my private property. You had no right to go in there, let alone store your stuff." Karen sighed dramatically, as if he were the unreasonable one. "Look, it's just temporary. I needed somewhere to put a few things while I reorganized my garage, and you weren't even using it properly. Honestly, you should be thanking me for making better use of the space." Ethan was this close to losing it. "You broke into my property." "Broken?" she repeated with a laugh. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Ethan. The door wasn't even locked." That was a lie, and they both knew it. She had removed his lock and conveniently forgotten to replace it. "I want it gone. Now," he said through clenched teeth. Karen just rolled her eyes. "I'll get around to it when I have time. No need to make a big fuss." The anger bubbling in Ethan's chest threatened to spill over. But arguing with Karen was pointless. She had a way of twisting things, making herself the victim no matter how wrong she was. So he took the next logical step. He reported her to the HOA board. Big mistake. At the next HOA meeting, Ethan presented his case. He showed pictures of his shed, proof that Karen had trespassed and was using his property without permission. He expected the board to shut her down immediately. Instead, they sided with her. Technically, one of them said, clearing his throat, if a structure isn't officially registered with the HOA, it can be designated for community use. Ethan's jaw nearly hit the floor. "It's my shed. It's been on my property for years." "Well," another board member chimed in, "according to our records, you never filled out a formal shed registration form, so technically it's in a gray area." A gray area? They were actually letting her get away with this? Karen sat there, smug as ever, acting like she had just won a great victory. She even dared to smile at Ethan across the room, as if daring him to do something about it. That's when he decided, if she wanted to use his shed, she was going to get the full experience. He wasn't just going to take this lying down. He was going to get even. And he knew exactly how to do it. Ethan wasn't the type to let things slide, especially not when it came to his property. If the HO wouldn't do anything about Karen's blatant trespassing, he'd handle it himself, his way. He needed a plan, something foolproof. something that would make Karen regret ever setting foot in his shed. And then, as if the universe itself handed him a gift, Ethan remembered something he had overheard months ago. At a previous HOA meeting, Karen had gone into full meltdown mode when she spotted a harmless garden snake slithering near the clubhouse entrance. She had screeched, jumped onto a chair, and demanded immediate action, ranting about how the neighborhood was infested and that something had to be done. That's when Ethan realized something crucial. Karen wasn't just afraid of snakes. She was terrified of them. A slow grin spread across his face as a devious plan formed in his mind. First, Ethan needed supplies. A quick internet search led him to a specialty shop that sold hyper-realistic rubber snakes. Some were small, others were enormous, and a few even had battery-operated motors to simulate movement. Perfect. He ordered 1,000 of them. A few days later, when the boxes arrived, Ethan felt like a kid on Christmas morning. He pulled out one of the motorized snakes, flicked the switch, and watched as it twitched and slithered just like the real thing. Karen was going to lose her mind. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Ethan got to work. He carefully arranged the snakes all over the shed, coiled on shelves, draped over bins, and hanging from the ceiling. He rigged several to fall from above the moment the door was opened. He even tied a few to fishing lines so they would move when disturbed. But the final touch was his masterpiece, a Bluetooth speaker hidden in the corner, programmed to play eerie hissing sounds whenever the door was opened. By the time he was finished, Ethan stepped back to admire his work. The shed now looked like a scene straight out of an Indiana Jones movie. Now, all he had to do was wait. It didn't take long. The next morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee on his porch, he spotted Karen strutting down the sidewalk toward his yard. Even from a distance, he could see she was on a mission, probably coming to dump even more junk into her shed. Ethan leaned back, suppressing a grin. Showtime. With a dramatic huff, Karen yanked the shed door open. The moment she stepped inside, the motion sensor triggered the speaker. A low, menacing hiss filled the space. Karen froze. Ethan could almost hear her brain short-circuiting. Then, bam! A rubber snake, rigged to the top of the door, fell straight onto her shoulder. Her scream shattered the peaceful morning air. Karen thrashed, smacking at herself, flinging the snake onto the floor. But that was just the beginning. As she stumbled backward, she knocked into one of the shelves, sending dozens of coiled snakes tumbling toward her. Another ear-piercing shriek followed as she scrambled to escape, but then the fishing line trick kicked in. One of the rubber snakes at her feet moved. Karen's horror reached new levels. She launched herself out of the shed with a banshee-like wail, tripping over her own feet and falling face-first onto the grass. For a split second, there was silence. And then, the laughter started. Unbeknownst to Karen, her meltdown had an audience. Several of the neighbors had been outside, and by the time she hit the ground, a small crowd had gathered. Some were trying to stifle their laughter. Others weren't even bothering. Even the HOA president, who had come over to investigate the commotion, had a hand over her mouth, barely containing a chuckle. Karen's face burned with humiliation. She scrambled to her feet, dirt streaked across her designer blouse, her hair sticking out wildly. She spun to face Ethan, her eyes blazing with fury. "You did this," she shrieked, jabbing a trembling finger at him. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, feigning innocence. "Did what? Don't play dumb with me," she spat. "You filled that shed with. She gestured wildly at the rubber snakes still scattered around her feet, her breathing erratic. "Snakes?" Ethan supplied helpfully. Karen bared her teeth in rage. "This is harassment. I'm going to report you to the HOA." And that was when the best moment of Ethan's life happened. The HOA president, standing directly behind her, cleared her throat. "Actually, Karen," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, "you violated HOA policy." Karen froze. Finally, she turned, her expression twisting into disbelief. What? Me?" The president nodded, holding up a neatly folded piece of paper. "The board has officially ruled that the shed is private property. The storage dispute is over. You had no right to use it without permission." Karen's face drained of color. But, and the president continued smoothly, "Since you entered and used another resident's property without their consent, that means you're in violation of HOA trespassing policies. So, we'll be issuing you a fine." Karen let out a strangled, choking noise. You're fining me?" The president gave a small, satisfied nod. Rules are rules, Karen. For years, Karen had wielded those words like a weapon. And now, they were being used against her. Karen's eye twitched. She was seconds away from a full-blown meltdown. And then, as if to add insult to injury, one of the motorized snakes twitched behind her. Karen screamed again, flailing wildly as she launched herself away from it. In the process, she stumbled straight into a flower bed, knocking over a decorative garden gnome as she fell flat on her back. That was it. The final, glorious cherry on top. Ethan lost it. He started laughing. Then, his neighbor joined in. And before he knew it, half the neighborhood was cracking up. Even the HOA president had to turn away, covering her mouth to keep from laughing outright. Karen, still sprawled in the dirt, looked like she wanted to disappear. Her face was a storm of emotions: humiliation, rage, disbelief. Finally, she scrambled to her feet, chest heaving. ILL. Ethan took another slow sip of his coffee, tilting his head. You'll what, Karen? She stiffened. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Because, you know, I still have that security footage of you breaking into my shed. Her entire face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. And then, in what was possibly the best moment of Ethan's life, she spun on her heel and stormed off, not saying another word. A stunned silence hung in the air for a moment. Then, Ethan's neighbor clapped him on the shoulder, still chuckling. Dude, he said, shaking his head. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Ethan just smiled. Victory had never felt so sweet. Karen's meltdown became the talk of the neighborhood. Within hours, whispers spread like wildfire. People relived every moment, how she had screamed, flailed, and ended up sprawled in the dirt, humiliated in front of everyone. And the best part? No one was stepping in to defend her. For years, Karen had ruled with an iron grip, terrorizing homeowners with fines and complaints. Now, she was the one being laughed at. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch sipping a well-earned drink, he noticed something different about the neighborhood. It felt lighter, more relaxed. People were outside chatting, kids were playing, and there was an unmistakable sense of camaraderie. It was as if the entire block had been freed from some unseen weight. Then, something even better happened. A neighbor, Mark, strolled by and gave Ethan a knowing nod. Check Karen's house when you get a chance. You're gonna love it. Curious, Ethan wandered down the street under the guise of taking out the trash. And there it was, pinned to Karen's front door in bold red letters, an HOA violation notice. Ethan nearly choked on his laughter. Apparently, her hedges were 2 inches too tall, an infraction she had fined countless others for over the years. And now, the rules had come back to bite her. It was poetic justice. Of course, Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. The next morning, Ethan was barely awake when he heard furious knocking at his door. He already knew who it was. Smirking, he took his time stretching, yawning, making sure she waited an extra minute before finally opening up. There she stood, disheveled, furious, looking like she hadn't slept all night. You think this is funny? She spat, shoving a finger in his face. Ethan arched an eyebrow. I think a lot of things are funny. You'll have to be more specific. Her eyes burned with rage. You're a menace. You set me up. You tried to kill me. Ethan let out a short laugh. With rubber snakes? Don't play dumb with me, she snapped. You knew exactly what you were doing. You. She was sputtering now, unraveling completely. It was beautiful. Ethan leaned casually against the doorframe. Here's the thing, Karen. I didn't break any rules. You did. Her jaw clenched. You broke into my shed. You stole my space. You used your power in the HOA to justify it. And now that it's backfired, you're playing the victim. Karen folded her arms tightly across her chest, nostrils flaring. I could have a heart condition. I could have died from the shock. Ethan smirked. Then maybe you shouldn't be breaking into people's sheds. Karen's face twitched. She was barely holding it together. Then she saw it. The HOA fine, taped right to Ethan's door. Her entire body stiffened. She snatched the paper, scanning the words, her face turning an alarming shade of red. A fine? She screeched. You're letting them fine me? Ethan shrugged. Rules are rules, Karen. For years, she had wielded those words like a weapon. And now, for the first time, they were being used against her. Karen tore the paper in half and threw it onto his porch. "This isn't over," she shrieked before storming off, loudly kicking over one of his potted plants as she left. Ethan let out a slow breath, watching her stomp away. She was unraveling, but she wasn't done yet. By that afternoon, Karen launched her final, desperate attack, an emergency HOA meeting. Ethan knew what was coming. She was going to try one last stunt, probably an attempt to have him fined, banned, or even evicted from the HOA. It was her last move. So he showed up. When Ethan walked into the HOA clubhouse, the tension in the air was thick. Karen was already at the front, talking at a mile a minute, pointing wildly at printouts, gesturing toward his house on a large neighborhood map. "And not only did he endanger my life," she was saying, voice rising, "but he has clearly demonstrated that he is an unhinged, dangerous neighbor. He has no respect for the HOA, for the rules. If we allow this to continue, we are setting a precedent for chaos." Ethan leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, waiting for his turn. The HOA president sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Karen, let's just—" "I want him fined," she screeched, slamming a list of violations onto the table. Ethan tilted his head. "Violations?" Karen spun to face him, eyes wild. "That's right. You have broken the rules too. Do you even have a permit for your shed? Do you?" Ethan took a slow step forward. "Actually, I do." Karen blinked. He pulled out a folder, and then, in front of the entire HOA board, he dropped it onto the table. Karen hesitated, then snatched it up. She started flipping through it, her breathing turning shallow. Inside was every single permit, approval, and registration document for his shed, dated, stamped, perfectly in order. Karen's hands started shaking. Ethan smirked. "See, after our last HOA meeting, I decided to double-check my paperwork. Turns out, my shed has been fully registered since the day I moved in." Karen's face drained of color. The HOA president took the file, flipping through it before nodding. "Well, that settles it then. No violations." Karen stumbled over her words. But he." Ethan cut her off. "And since I have security footage of you breaking into my shed, if we're talking about violations, shouldn't we discuss trespassing laws?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. A heavy silence filled the room. The HOA president sighed. "Karen, I think we've had enough drama for 1 week. I suggest you pay your fine and move on." And just like that, it was over. Karen stormed out of the meeting, defeated, humiliated, and stripped of her power. The moment the door slammed behind her, one of the board members laughed. Another gave Ethan a nod of approval. That night, he went home, poured himself a drink, and sat on his porch, watching the neighborhood. The storm had passed. Karen wasn't banished, not yet, anyway. But she was finished. She didn't hold power anymore. She wouldn't be terrorizing anyone with bogus fines or ridiculous demands. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood belonged to the people again. And as Ethan looked over at his shed, now completely snake-free, he smiled. He had won. The day after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Freer. Karen had lost her grip on the community, and everyone knew it. Ethan sat on his porch, sipping his morning coffee, watching neighbors pass by with an unusual sense of ease. People who once hurried past Karen's house, afraid of being written up for some made-up infraction, now walked freely, chatting with one another. Then came the real kicker. Another HOA violation notice was taped to Karen's door. Ethan smirked as he strolled by, pretending to check his mailbox. Apparently, her paint color was no longer in compliance with HOA regulations, the same paint color she had once fined a neighbor for using. Oh, the irony. Word spread fast. By noon, nearly every homeowner in the community had heard about Karen's second violation, and this time, no one was stepping in to help her. Even her former allies on the HOA board had begun to distance themselves. She was truly alone. But Karen wasn't one to go down without a final, desperate attempt to claw her way back to power. Late that evening, as Ethan relaxed on his porch, his phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, Mark. "Dude, check the HOA forum. Karen's up to something." Ethan sighed and pulled up the community website. Sure enough, Karen had posted a lengthy, rambling message. "To my fellow residents," it began, "it has become clear that the integrity of our community is at risk. Certain individuals have taken it upon themselves to undermine the values we have all worked so hard to maintain. If we do not act now, we risk descending into chaos. I will be proposing a petition to restore order and bring accountability back to our neighborhood. If you care about our community, I urge you to sign it." Ethan scrolled down. 0 signatures. He snorted. Karen was done, and everyone knew it. The comment section was even better. "Karen, the only thing this neighborhood needs protection from is you. Didn't you just get fined? Maybe focus on fixing your own violations before trying to restore order. Nobody's signing this, lady. Take the hint." Karen had officially lost her audience. A week passed, then 2. Karen had gone quiet, which was almost disappointing. Ethan had half expected her to launch some ridiculous legal battle or file a bogus lawsuit against him. Instead, she stayed in her house, blinds drawn, avoiding all interaction. Then, one morning, as Ethan took his usual walk, he saw it. A for sale sign planted firmly in Karen's front yard. He stopped in his tracks, taking a moment to fully absorb it. Karen was leaving. The neighborhood, once held under her rule, was finally free. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A few houses down, Mark spotted the sign and let out a low whistle. Well, looks like the queen is abdicating her throne." Ethan smirked. "Guess she couldn't handle living under her own rules. Think she'll actually sell?" Ethan shrugged. "Probably. She's got no power left here." As if sensing they were talking about her, Karen's blinds shifted slightly. A pair of furious eyes glared out at them before snapping shut again. Mark grinned. "She's watching us, isn't she?" "Oh yeah. Want to give her a wave?" Ethan raised his coffee mug in a mock salute. Karen's blinds shut for good. A month later, Karen was gone. No one threw a farewell party. No one helped her pack. By the time her house was officially sold, the neighborhood had already moved on, happier and more relaxed than it had been in years. The HOA had undergone some serious changes, too. With Karen out, a new board was elected, one not run by power-hungry tyrants. Fines were reduced, ridiculous regulations were thrown out, and for the first time in a long time, people actually enjoyed living there. Ethan celebrated in his own way. He threw a neighborhood liberation barbecue, inviting everyone over to mark the occasion. Burgers, steaks, cold drinks, it was the kind of gathering Karen would have hated. And the best part? He had one final touch. Mounted right above his shed door, for everyone to see, was a brand new sign. Private property, no trespassing. And just below it, a smaller sign. Warning, snake storage facility. Enter at your own risk. Just a little reminder of the chaos that had finally come to an end. As Ethan leaned back, watching his neighbors laugh and enjoy themselves, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was truly home again. And Karen was just a bad memory.